really good news that the US has come back into the Paris Agreement and has made the commitments it's already made, including joining the other G7 in the doubling of climate finance. And the US contribution is $11.4 billion. So thank you for that. And then thirdly, the science is clear and we need to act now to halve emissions by 2030 and to keep the 1.5 degree increase in global temperature within reach. So again, we can't start too soon. But the really good news is that the narrative has been changing in those interim years since Paris. And now there are overwhelmingly more world leaders who want to work together to try and meet that target.
That's fantastic. Now, what does the UK hope to achieve over the next 2 weeks? What does success look like for you?
Well, that's a very important question. I'm sure there'll be lots and lots of people eager to seize on what happens at COP. But I think that the very important thing for us is that we don't just get the ambitious commitments, we actually get concrete actions to implement them. And that in the past has been one of the problems. But I would point to four very clear goals. The first is to keep that 1.5 degree target within reach, which means securing a global net zero by mid-century, by 2050. And that means in turn that countries need to commit to actions in four particular areas: power, transport, deforestation, and methane. The second goal would be about adapting to protect communities and natural habitat. It's very important to have sustainable farming in this concept, very important to assist developing countries with some of the very difficult tasks they face. The third goal is around mobilizing finance. We want developed countries to make good on their promise to mobilize at least $100 billion in climate finance per year. The delivery plan demonstrates this is within reach, but it goes beyond transition to a net zero financial system. And we need at the same time to catalyze the trillions of dollars in private investment that's needed. And Mark Carney and others have been doing some fantastic work to help bring the private sector along so that we can do this, and also develop green climate finance instruments, which again will help developing countries adapt to this new reality. And then the last goal we have is to work together, government, private society, private sector, civil society, to finalize what's called the Paris Rulebook. This is about the detailed underpinnings that make the Paris Agreement operational. And we want that climate action to be accelerated by this collaboration between government, private sector, and civil society. So those are our four main goals.
Hugely ambitious. And we're looking forward to reaching all those goals. But what are some of the signals that we should be looking out for over the next 2 weeks to suggest that the COP is on track to reaching those goals?
Well, I don't want to set hard and fast rules, Randy, because then if one isn't met, that will unnerve people and the media will seize on that. But I think there are some very strong indications that we can look for. I would say the first is to have the world leaders set out their clear commitments and concrete timelines on the four areas of energy, transport, finance, and nature. That's very important. We want to see more of the participants at COP come out with concrete plans, whether that's governments or the private sector or civil society. I think it is fair. You will have heard Prime Minister Boris Johnson say today that COP is touch and go for that 1.5 degrees target. And it's clear that some of the biggest polluters have not yet done as much as they could do. So we really want to use these last few days before world leaders leave to try and get those commitments up to the level I was talking about. And we want to follow the science. We need to act now to halve emissions by 2030. And that's critical to keeping 1.5 degrees within reach.
Thank you. Now, final question. Regardless of the outcomes here at the COP, what do we, the world, countries, companies, organizations, need to be doing on November 13th, so the day after the COP, and then beyond, to address the climate crisis? So whatever happens here, what do we do next?
I think that's a really good point. It doesn't all end on November 13th. We need President Biden's decade of ambition. We need to see it as the beginning of a new chapter in tackling climate at these much higher levels of ambition and engagement. And above all, we need to keep that narrative going about 1.5 degrees, about getting down to global net zero by mid-century, about giving developing countries the help that they need. That's an ongoing task. We want to be able to share best practice on things like sustainable farming, looking after nature, practicing deforestation, so that we can help that adaptation that's so critical. And we want to keep acting with the private sector. I think everyone's very much aware that you cannot achieve the levels of engagement and money needed to tackle all these things without the support and help of the private sector. And the private sector has really stepped up in this last year in particular, and joined campaigns like Race to Net Zero. So we want that partnership to continue, making full use of all these new climate finance instruments, along with the help from civil society. And we fundamentally need people to start changing their behaviors at the individual level, whether you change what you eat, or at the corporate and institutional level, making more energy efficient buildings, putting more effort into jobs and growth arising from tackling climate change. So fundamentally, we want to see this decade, we want to see a shift in approach at much higher levels of ambition and concrete action.
Ambassador Pierce, thank you so much. Real pleasure speaking with you. I'm looking forward to seeing you back in Washington. But what a scene setter for the next 2 weeks.
Thank you.
So huge thanks for joining us today, and maybe we will follow up towards the end of the 2 weeks and see how you think it's going. I'd like to pivot now to our panel conversation that we'll be doing during live from COP. And to run this panel, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Andrea Clabaugh. Andrea.
Thank you. Brilliant. All right, well, good afternoon, everyone from the Climate Action Solutions Center here in Scotland. Wherever you are in the world today, we are delighted to have you joining us for this opening panel discussion here for Atlantic Council Live at COP. I am Andrea Clabaugh, and I'm a non-resident senior fellow with the Atlantic Council Global Energy Center. And joining me today are three expert commentators who are going to help us delve into these very complex and very challenging issues that will be discussed in detail here at COP26 and also here at the Climate Action Solutions Center. Each of these gentlemen have played an enormous role in pulling CASK together and bringing us really all together for these very, very important discussions. So let me start with some brief introductions. Immediately to my right is Michael Liebreich, who is the chairman and CEO of Liebreich Associates, as well as the co-founding partner of Eco-Pragma Capital and an advisor to the UK Board of Trade. Next, we have David Goldwyn, who is the chairman of the Atlantic Council Global Energy Advisory Group and president of Goldwyn Global Strategies, LLC. He is also a former State Department Special Envoy and Coordinator for International Energy Affairs. And then finally, we have Duncan Burt, who is the Chief Sustainability Officer at National Grid, one of the largest listed utilities in the world, and leads the group's engagement on decarbonization and climate change issues. Thanks to all of you, and a very warm welcome to the panel today. So just to briefly kick us off, Michael, what is CASK? What are we doing here? What are some of the key goals for this program? And in what ways would you say this is unique and different from some of what we're seeing in the green zone and the blue zones?
Well, thank you very much for the question, Andrea, and it's a great pleasure to be here. So what is CASK? CASK really originated out of a thought that I had that we needed a space during COP where we could have discussions that were really in-depth, substantive amongst key stakeholders that were not necessarily directly linked to the negotiations. I was aware that there was a dearth of locations, perhaps in Glasgow. It was not, and it was not obvious during COVID that there would be preparations across the board for those sorts of incredibly important discussions. So together with the National Grid, they would mention National Grid, Octopus Energy, and then I brought in Atlantic Council to help to create this space where we could have these discussions. And very importantly, what we're trying to do is get beyond the pledges, beyond the low-hanging fruit, and into these really difficult discussions. This is not easy stuff, and we had to have a location to do that, and that's a little bit different from what's happening, in the green zone, in the blue zone, in the negotiations. We're here to have really substantive discussions.
Excellent. All of that sounds very fascinating and like a really excellent lineup to look forward to. So David, on that note, thinking about the lineup and what's going to be coming up soon, we would love to hear a little bit more about some of the conversations we expect to be having over this week and next. And what are some of the key challenges we really hope to dig into as we go into some of these discussions?
Great, thanks, Andrea. Well, we have a tremendous advantage in being here because all of the stakeholders that are playing a role in the energy transition are here. Inside the blue and the green zone, of course, we've got the government folks, but we've got national utilities, we've got international financial institutions, we have entrepreneurs, and we have technologists. So the things that we're going to talk about are the problems that Michael referred to, which is really hard. How do you make the transition from coal to electricity? So tonight we're talking about climate finance, which is how do you mobilize private capital. Tomorrow we're going to be talking about how to change, into both to mobilize offshore wind and financing for that, but also how to get off coal and get to net zero. We'll be talking about the developing world and how to attract capital and how to make that transition. We'll be talking about nature-based solutions and also how to move electricity systems and decarbonize grids at the terawatt scale, at a huge scale. Friday night, we're going to be talking about decarbonizing agriculture. And for CASK Live, or from live from the Atlantic Council, live from COP, on Wednesday, we're going to have Bill Gates and John Kerry and talking about this kind of transformation. And then on Saturday, we're going to have the bipartisan delegation from the U.S., led by Senators Kuhn and Senator Braun, talking about their work. So we'll have a great program on live from COP, and we'll be talking about all these critical issues as well.
Excellent. Thank you for that wonderful explanation. So getting into some of those specific issues a bit more clearly. So Duncan, obviously you're representing National Grid here at CASK. And of course, National Grid has a very significant presence both here and at COP itself. So why is National Grid here at the COP and also at CASK? What are your goals for the COP, and what are you hoping to see happen in these extremely challenging debates?
But, I mean, very much building on what Michael and David said, we absolutely see this decade as critical to be really pushing and accelerating delivery of the things that we know we need to do, and that is to decarbonize grids, to shift transport onto electric power, and to resolve some of the remaining policy issues around how we heat buildings and how we manage some of those broader, harder to reach industrial processes and technologies. And this is, to Mark's point, this is not a time for more grand targets. They help, they bring capital, they bring attention, but we are into hard delivery. We're in the UK now. The UK is almost halfway to net zero from its original 1990 targets. We've done the easy half. The second half is much harder, and that means that we need to have the confidence that everyone is pushing towards the same goal, and that we've got policy keeping pace with finance, keeping pace with the processes that sit across the industrial sectors involved.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Well, what a wonderful framing of everything that will be happening here over the next couple of weeks. So I want to dig a little bit deeper into some of the difficulties that are ahead, some of the really challenging issues that will need to be delved further into as we go forward. And I want to turn to Michael, because I know, Michael, you have a very particular perspective on this issue. And I wanted to reference a recent blog post that you published with the Bloomberg New Energy Finance. And you specifically said that we should toast Glasgow, even if we are already toast. And it seemed to be that you were saying that Glasgow will be a success, but that it would be an inadequate success. What did you mean by that?
Right. Well, thanks for that question. And this is a tough topic in terms of what does success look like when we're really talking about a process that's has already taken decades and is likely to take decades more. So the idea that Glasgow would suddenly come up with some miraculous breakthrough where we could say, yes, we've won, that's success, that's not really realistic. So what I tried to write in that piece was to say, well, first of all, for the real aficionados, the real technocrats, there's lots of sort of negotiations around this thing called Article 6 and how you account for offsets and the Paris rule book, which the Ambassador Pierce talked about in the introductory remarks. And, yes, we've got to tick those off, but for the broad mass of business and financiers and the world at large, actually, it's about taking those net zero pledges that we've all been hearing about and putting them into the nationally determined contributions, the actual dossiers that get filed with the UN that back that up. And that's going to happen. That's clear because the countries have already signaled and we have to go through all of the theater of registering those, but it's going to happen. And it's a huge success because you have to see 5 years ago, of course it was 6 years because of COVID, there was the Paris Agreement, which was a framework. And there were some people saying, well, it's not binding and we don't know if it's going to work and so on. And then there were the Paris contributions, which were very mild. They really didn't constrain emissions at all. So here we are in Glasgow 6 years later. And first of all, the Paris framework clearly works. It has brought back the US. It has elicited pledges from China. It has elicited pledges from Australia, from countries like Saudi Arabia, from Russia. So it's clearly the framework works. And the 5-year ratchet works as well, right? Because the plans that are being lodged are much more ambitious. So it's fantastic, success guaranteed. The problem, and the reason why I said even if we're toast, was to raise the point that it's not going to be enough. Whatever is registered here in terms of those pledges is not enough to get us to 1.5 degrees on two fronts. One, the ambition is not high enough. So that decade of ambition is still needed. And two, they're only pledges. They're only pledges. You've got to go beyond that and you've got to get into the action. And that's where you could be slightly less optimistic if you wanted to be.
Certainly. So it seems then that there is a tremendous amount of work potentially yet to be done to get us really where we need to go.
Oh, yes. The job is by no means done. Not at all. Not at all.
Certainly. And that's why we're here at CASK. So I want to turn to David and segue actually from some of what Michael was talking about and really thinking through, in your mind, what does a win look like for the COP? What does it mean to really succeed here in your mind, thinking through some of how Michael has framed this and just generally what that would look like for the international community?
Thanks, Andrea. Well, I think first there has to be, I think the minimum threshold is government commitments. They've got to finish the rule book. They've got to do Chapter 6. They've got to fulfill the financing commitments. So that's kind of the minimum standard. But I think what's really going to define the success of the COP is seizing this political moment where now markets have accepted that climate risk is real and urgent. They are only willing to put their capital and to put ESG capital into companies that accept the commitment and have a strategy for adopting and living through the energy transition. And that has the potential to move an enormous amount of capital into the energy transition if the policy framework is right, if the cost of capital is competitive, and if there's a strategy for figuring out, as Duncan has pointed out, in transport, in power, in nature-based solutions, how you're going to get from here to there. So I think the announcements that we're going to see from coalitions, coalitions of companies that are going to try and decarbonize heavy industry, the First Movers Coalition, I think those companies are going to send a signal to the markets that money needs to go into this and that change is happening. If we have that, I think that's going to be a real pillar of success. And I think from the developing world, both that commitment and a willingness to adopt policy to make their economies competitive and attractive for investment. I think you have that moment where capital can move to these places and make real change. And I think, as Michael has pointed out, in his new energy finance history, technology can move a lot faster than we think if people are investing in it. And so I think that will be the optimism that comes out of COP, is that we really have a moment here if we can have a pathway for change. And that pathway is what we're trying to talk about here at the Climate Action Solutions Center.
Excellent. So it almost seems as if you're saying that really what's happening in the private sector is in many ways just as important, perhaps arguably even more important than what's happening at the governmental level in terms of the overall significance for reducing global emissions.
Absolutely. Governments are pledging billions. Private markets need to provide trillions.
Excellent. Thank you. So I want to turn back to Duncan again, and again thinking through how National Grid sees these issues. And obviously these are tremendously important to National Grid's strategy and vision as a company. How does National Grid see these really crucial challenges that we've been discussing in terms of solving the decarbonization debate? And how is National Grid actively involved in these issues and actively influencing this conversation?
So, there's a few things in there. Our analysis is that we should not be distracted by debates about whether China is pulling its weight or whether the United States quite is going to form in terms of policy. We see now those three major markets, the US, EU, and China, now moving inevitably towards ultra-low carbon economies. And really, this is a question of industrial competition as much as anything else, and commercial advantage as to how those markets move. We do really want to see really clear alignment on things such as the transition to electric vehicles and some of the big policy measures that most of the developed world economies should be implementing, because that really will drive capital into those markets and into those sectors to help accelerate it. And you cannot understate, from our perspective, the re-arrival of the US back onto the scene with some very serious policy engagement. The amount of money, the energy and innovation that is going to come from that fantastic market, really driving pace, innovation and investment through that sector, we think is incredibly exciting. For us, when we look at that picture, we see a world in which currently electricity in a developed economy tends to provide about 20% of end-use energy. That figure will go up, probably according to the IEA and according to us, between about 50 and 70% of end-use energy. So it's going to be transformative in terms of how we think about our business. With that comes a lot of responsibility to the communities that we serve, but also a real responsibility to help get those blockers out of the way and make sure that people aren't looking for car chargers, that people aren't worried about whether they can connect a heat pump in their home, and that people understand the role that they can play, and they're not worried about putting 2 jumpers on or going vegetarian, but actually they can understand that by buying an EV or investing in energy efficiency for their home, they can make a meaningful and fast difference and really help drive that change.
Certainly. So it seems to me that the key word in terms of how National Grid thinks about this is acceleration, going where we want to go, but going as fast as we can in order to meet the goals that we know we need to meet. So to drill down into that a little bit more, in terms of the electricity sector, you mentioned the electrification is going to be one of the most crucial trends and most important enabling trends in order to get us to a world that is compliant with a 1.5 degree scenario. What do you think the COP can do, or perhaps can happen here at the COP or in the coming years, the most significant developments that will really push the electricity sector and electrification in that direction at the pace that we need to be going at?
Well, we think alignment around some of those key milestones over the next decade and just beyond into the 2030s is really helpful. Both the US and the UK really being clear that they're aiming for a zero carbon grid by 2035 is incredibly helpful, because everything maps back from there. And to deliver by 2035, any notebook that we would get out and write that plan on starts 5 years ago, and we need to be moving really quickly at it now, and we are. And that helps us sit down with regulators, helps us sit down with state administrators or the UK government and really work out what needs to happen. You know, and alongside that, with our communities, if they have the confidence that this is coming from government, you know, working with private sector, then we build that trust that we are going to need to help navigate some of those challenging political questions as we go through the next decade.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for adding all of those very important and very impactful ideas to the conversation, and generally what we know needs to be done and needs to be happening on the world stage. So I want to turn briefly to some of the questions we've been getting from the audience. And of course, we have a virtual audience watching online today who have been able to submit questions to the Atlantic Council for our panel discussion. So just to turn to a couple of those, I want to talk through one of the thorniest issues facing the COP, and that is Article 6. This is something that has been many years in the making, many years in the resolving, so to speak, or so we hope. So the question is asking, will Article 6 be solved in Glasgow? And I would perhaps add to that, even if we did solve it, is that really solving the core problem? Is that really getting us where we need to go in terms of what Article 6 was designed to do?
I'll have a go at that, although
Please.
you know, you could spend a whole lifetime trying to understand the debates around Article 6. So just for Article 6 is all about where you have a project, you have a country that has an obligation to reduce its emissions, and instead of doing it in that country, that the action will be taken somewhere else, but the country A, in a sense, will fund the activities in country B. And it's been a very thorny problem. There was an attempt, there was something called CDM under the Kyoto Protocol. Of course, that's fallen away. So the attempt is to create a replacement. And the hope was that would really funnel a lot of money, that once that is solved, then a lot of funding will be funneled. And of course, there is the Copenhagen commitment, the $100 billion, which is not $100 billion, it's $100 billion per year, which is supposed to be flowing from the global north to the global south. And we haven't quite got there. It's got to something like 80 billion, and it's a disappointment that it hasn't. The idea is that if we solve Article 6, then in a sense, all of that will fall away and lots of money, enough money would flow under Article 6. Will it happen? Will there be an Article 6? Mm-hmm. If I had to guess, I think yes. And the reason is I think that it's 5 years after Paris. It's the last really difficult, outstanding element of the Paris rule book. Mm-hmm. The desire is there. And at some point, all these heads of state who want to make these great sweeping statements about their commitment to climate action, they're going to have to come up with some sort of compromise. So at least there's a form of words, and we have an Article 6. The second part of your question is, will it be really meaningful? Will it actually lead to flows, 100 billion a year, and then growing? Because actually the global south needs much more than that, needs many hundreds of billions per year. Will it lead to that? There I'm going to say probably not. It will be helpful, but I actually think that private action, now you've got all these companies, you've got all these, you know, whether it's oil and gas companies, airlines, all sorts of companies pledging net zero, that is going to drive the voluntary markets in carbon offsets, in reforestation, in all sorts of projects outside their countries of location, of origin. And those flows are likely, I believe, to be much more substantial than those inter-country flows that are largely going to be what Article 6 is about. So we will see growing flows of finance, but it may not technically come from a resolution of that very, very knotty Article 6 problem. I'm sorry, it's a long and complex question, but I'm sure you'll get the next question will be even more technical, so you can move on.
Don't worry, the next question is even more difficult because we're going to move slightly into a little bit of more of a geopolitical question, if you will. So someone asks, how will the absence of Presidents Xi and Putin affect the course of negotiations at the COP, particularly given the enormous share of global emissions shared between China and Russia?
I can jump in on that one. I don't think it's going to affect it much. I mean, people knew coming in that China was not going to move off its 2060 plan. It might do something at some point in the future, but it's not going to do it here. And I think the same is true of the Russians. But the what's going to make a difference going forward is not so much whether they're here and what they have to say. It's how they're going to survive the world that's to come. And what's really coming, which links on to chapter 6, is carbon accounting. So as companies try and drive carbon out of their value chain, and as countries try and fulfill their commitments, the world of trade is going to change. People are going to have a globally acceptable system for measuring their carbon footprints, both for goods and for commodities, whether that's trade in LNG or it's trade in steel. We saw it from the recent steel announcement that the US has done with the EU. And so the Russians and the Chinese are going to have to compete in a world in which people want lower carbon goods and commodities. And they will either succeed in doing that by making domestic change, or they will lose out on the global stage and other competitors will win. So I think it's going to be a stronger forcing event than US or other diplomats telling them this is a moral commitment they need to fulfill. It's going to be a question of survival, and whether they like it or not, they're going to have to succeed or lose in that competition.
Understood. Very interesting. Thank you, David. So we have one last time for one more audience question for tonight. And I think that this one actually might be very well suited for Duncan because you had discussed the importance of leadership, real concerted, thoughtful leadership on these extremely difficult issues. And so this question is asking, to that point, with the United States return to the Paris Agreement, what does President Biden specifically need to do in Glasgow to show the world that the United States is truly and sincerely ready to lead again on climate change?
Well, I'm not sure you can deliver all of that in Glasgow, because a lot of that is going to happen in Washington, isn't it? And that remains an incredibly important process. And I think the administration and Americans know that the rest of the world is watching that as closely as they're watching legislation in their own countries, wherever they are. For us, it's incredibly important to the process for our businesses on the east coast of the US. So we hope to see that make its course, steadily and safely through to definitive action. I think alongside that, the broader messages coming out of the administration are really incredibly valuable. The tone that has been set in the automotive industry, for example, means that without really any cajoling beyond the environmental standards in place, the global automotive industry has itself effectively determined that it will stop making combustion engines within the next 5 years. And that 10 years ago, that idea would be considered absolutely remarkable. And yet here we are. And we can see that happening in steel. We can see that happening in many other sectors. And these are all sectors in which the US can play a huge global role in helping make that happen.
Certainly. So it comes back to the point of there's a great deal of work to do, but there's a lot of momentum pushing us forward to make these really important changes in the way that the world consumes and uses energy in order to have economic growth and bring prosperity throughout the world. And the challenge is real, but there's a lot of momentum to get us there. So on that very positive note, we'll go ahead and close out the discussion this evening. Gentlemen, thank you for very insightful comments and a fascinating discussion. This has been a delightful scene setter to kick us off for what I'm sure will be a couple of weeks of very intensive discussions on very difficult issues, and which all remain to be solved, to be sure. So with that, I will go ahead and turn it back to Randy to close us out for this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea, and thank you, everybody. That was really fascinating. I learned a ton, as I always do when I speak with you. Thank you all for joining us today. Please tune in for future episodes of Atlantic Council Live from COP26. They will be every day at 5 p.m. GMT, plus there will be a couple of special episodes happening at other times. You can find out more on the Atlantic Council website, and we'll be emailing information out about those as well. Please do share with your friends and colleagues. This was on the Atlantic Council website, or will be so momentarily, as well as the Atlantic Council YouTube. And thank you to everybody who helped put this event together today. The entire team at CASK was really involved. So thanks so much, and have a good rest of your day.